pizza crust time. All right, homemade pizza crust. You get to smell it while it's rising. You get to chop all your ingredients while it's rising, throw it in the oven, bake it, and then you have homemade pizza. Okay, this is a wheat-based pizza crust, so it does have gluten. If you need to be gluten-free, this one isn't for you. That's a different type of crust. We can do that another day. This, however, is homemade. We are going to be using, what I have out here today is just all-purpose flour because it's what I have on hand. It can also be made with bread flour as well as whole wheat flour. Just depending on what you have, it goes by weight, not by volume. That is the biggest trick that will keep you successful if you're going back and forth between whole wheat, all-purpose, and bread flour. A lot of it has to do with how much gluten they have per volume, but also whole wheat flour is much denser than white flour. So your white flour or all-purpose flour will look bigger than whole wheat flour for the same weight. Let's get started. First, I'm going to take this bowl. This bowl is 8 quarts, and really this is about as big of a bowl as you're going to need for this particular recipe. I only have one bowl that's 8 quarts, whereas I have multiple bowls that are 13 quarts, so I'm using the 1 8 and then a 13. But if you don't have a bowl this size on hand, don't worry, you can still make this pizza. But if you want to keep cooking with me, I really use this size bowl a lot. I do have a large family, but if you do not have a large family, using this size thing means you don't have to cook as frequently. You can, almost everything I make can be stored in the freezer or that type of thing. So I'm big on cooking ahead. This recipe is designed to make 4 pizzas this size. This is a regular half sheet pan. Now, currently, what I'll be doing with it today is I will make 3 pizzas that are this size and then 2 circle pans. And this is at the request of my youngest, who feels that pizza is just not the same when it's a circle. I disagree, because when you look at your oven and you look at the space in your oven, tell me which one better maximizes the space of your oven. The one that's almost the same size and shape as each tray, or the little tiny circle that sits in the middle and wastes all that space? Okay, but needless to say, this recipe will make plenty of both. First things first, we need water. To wake up our yeast, just like when we made bread dough, we need warm water between 80 and 90 degrees, which means it can be tap water, unless your tap water is just completely undrinkable. I would just use tap water. You should still be able to put your hands in it. Mine's pretty warm. And you're gonna need 1 quart of this warm water, 4 cups or 1 quart. So when I'm getting down to eye level, if you are not familiar with cooking and baking yet, I am checking for the meniscus of my water, and I'm still just a little bit short. This is a really forgiving procedure. When you check for the meniscus, you're looking for the midline of your water, because it's taller at the edges than it is in the middle. So to get where your volume is on a liquid, you want to look for the middle level. Now, don't spend all day trying to get everything completely accurate on this bread. It's very forgiving. Next, so we have our warm water. Next, we need to add our yeast. This is baker's yeast as opposed to brewer's yeast, or I also use nutritional yeast frequently. Baker's yeast is still a living organism. It's asleep. So we're gonna wake it up with some warm water. And like most other things, when they wake up, it's gonna be hungry. So we're gonna give it some white sugar to eat. Not much. And most of the sugar, as it would get passed on to us, is consumed by the yeast as they begin to make the bread rise. So it was 2 tablespoons of yeast and a 1/4 cup of sugar. When you're doing a yeasted bread product that you don't need to sweeten extra beyond what you need to wake the yeast up, the rule of thumb, or the guide that I generally see for how much to use, it should be double your volume that you use for your yeast. So because I use 2 tablespoons of yeast, it's 4 tablespoons of sugar. 4 tablespoons is the same as a 1/4 cup. Or it's 2 ounces. 2 ounces, 1/4 cup, 4 tablespoons. As you cook and bake more, a lot of those conversions will just get faster. So we're gonna start measuring our dry ingredients, but you can see how it's already starting to form a film on the top. We want this to get foamy, and that is how we know that the yeast is waking up and it's getting active. You want active yeast in your bread so it will rise evenly and efficiently. So we'll just let it do its thing for a couple of minutes. We're gonna come around. Kitchen tool that you will use and use and use and use is a kitchen scale. This one, the brand doesn't matter. What you want, I like the pedestal style. I have a couple of flat ones, but when you put a big bowl on a flat scale, you can't see your weight. I learned that the hard way. Hence, I ended up with one that's a little bit more of a pedestal. We turn it on, and we are going to zero it, and I'm gonna wanna use it in ounces, which it looks like it's in. Sometimes I use grams. So, for this recipe, we need 4 pounds, 4 ounces of flour, or 4 1/4 pounds of flour. I am not going to stand here all day measuring this cup by cup. Also, it's not consistent when you do this. Flour is one of the most difficult things to measure by volume. Your life will become so much easier when you just start measuring it by weight. So we're at a little over halfway there. Getting there. Ooh, we're almost there. Oh, so close. Okay. I'm a shade over, but that's okay. A shade over is all right. I mean, if you want to, you can just pinch a little bit out, but we don't need to. Now, all-purpose flour is not a high gluten flour, so I'm going to add gluten to it. I generally speaking add gluten whenever I'm making a yeasted bread, unless I'm using whole wheat, simply because even bread flour, when it's manufactured in several parts of the country, is not enough gluten to really give your dough a good stretch, and good stretch equals good rise. So adding a little bit of gluten just kind of guarantees that it happens correctly. I'm gonna do 2 tablespoons. And again, that's a forgiving measure, so you don't need to be, you could, scoop it, level it, do that type of thing with it, but you don't really need to. Now, next ingredient is salt. This actually helps control the leavening process, and it enhances the flavor. If you are on a diet that does not have, where your doctor says no salt, don't put the salt in. Your bread dough will still work. I'm grabbing a teaspoon measuring spoon. So I'm gonna add 2 teaspoons of salt. This, again, helps the bread, and it definitely enhances flavor, but it is not necessary. If your doctor tells you no salt, don't add it. All right, the other 2 ingredients I'm gonna add to the dry mix are also optional, but I think really taste good when you're doing Italian cooking. I'm going to add a little bit of thyme. So this is just thyme. It's not ground. And It's a pinch, that's probably a little bit over a teaspoon. I'm gonna take it in my hands, and I notice I'm wearing gloves. I'm wearing gloves because I'm gonna be kneading it in a minute, and gloves definitely help when you're kneading bread. And I'm kind of bruising it and crushing it over the flour. And then next is rosemary. If you have it fresh, awesome. You still want to bruise it and chop it up tiny to put it in. This one I'm doing probably about between 2 teaspoons and a tablespoon of rosemary, but I really like rosemary. And then this I'm definitely taking and crushing up in my hands. Bruising it helps release the aroma and the oils. And also it kind of, rosemary, it's an evergreen plant. You can see the needles. Those needles can kind of catch people unaware if they're left whole. So I crush them a little bit. There we go. So there's our dry ingredients. Check it out. You see all the foam? That's exactly what we want. That means the yeast is awake and active for the most part. You can see there's that one little bit that's not awake yet, but it'll be just fine because we're gonna wake it up in a minute. Okay, so this is olive oil, extra virgin olive oil. If you are on an oil-free diet, you can simply skip this, just add probably a 1/3 cup more water. It definitely changes the flavor, and if you can tolerate oil in your diet, extra virgin olive oil does have health benefits and definite flavor benefits. You want to go with the extra virgin if you have it versus regular olive oil. Extra virgin means it's the first time those little olives are crunched and squished, and then they're just squished once. Regular or other grades of olive oil, the olives get squished again and again and again and again, so you get every last leftover out. So the flavor is not as strong in the other grades of olive oil. Now, we're gonna take our dry ingredients and add them into our wet. And we're gonna hang on to this bowl that the dry ingredients were in. We're gonna oil that bowl. See how I still have some oil left? I'm gonna put my measuring cup in there upside down. And I'm gonna take my gloves, kind of wipe the inside of that measuring cup. So if you do not add oil to your dough, you're still gonna wanna oil this bowl, or else you're gonna spend all day trying to get your dough back out of it after it's risen. So this is how you oil a bowl. And this will also help the dough to not stick quite so much to your gloves, although as it becomes thoroughly kneaded, it'll pull away naturally. So see how this does kind of fill this bowl? It's all right, it just means I have to be kind of careful. When you use a bigger bowl when you're kneading, it allows for a little bit more room for error, or messiness, as you knead your flour and your water and your yeast, all that good stuff together. Now, the kneading process is super important. Yes, if you have a stand mixer, you can use a dough hook on your stand mixer, but I will caution you, I had a very nice KitchenAid stand mixer for several years until I started making bread and decided to use my KitchenAid for doing the bread dough. It will put added wear on the motor of your stand mixer. So I just prefer it to do it by hand. This amount of dough would be too much for most stand mixers anyway. Most of them max out between 6 and 8 quarts. A lot of them only 4 quarts. So this is an 8-quart bowl, and you can see how it really fills it. It wouldn't do so well. Now, the kneading process is very important when you're doing a yeasted bread, because it's taking 2 amino acids and causing them to combine together into gluten, which yes, you added a couple tablespoons of, but this is like finding all the rest of the pieces that make gluten in the wheat flour and making them squish together and saying, no, you're gonna make gluten so then you can stretch. That's what this process is all about. You don't want any pieces of it to be left looking dry, just like you don't want to leave any puddles. Now, when you're making cakes or cookies, or especially things like muffins or cupcakes, you can definitely overmix your batter, and that is because you're not using yeast to make them rise. You're using a different leavening agent, and so you do not ever want to knead those batters. But this, you need to knead it because you're depending on that reaction to allow the dough to stretch and form air bubbles. All right, this one is almost there. The next step is really just time to allow the yeast to munch through the sugars that are found naturally in the wheat, as well as that little bit of sugar that you added in to get it started. See how my gloves are basically clean? Now, again, you can do this barehanded. I prefer using gloves when I'm dealing with food, but I really prefer using them when doing dough because I don't enjoy picking bread dough out from underneath my fingernails. That's the basic reason. All right, I think this is about at a point where we can let it rise. Okay, pizza crust are a single rise, which means when we're gonna wait until this doubles. Oh, and I did flip it over. Ooh, that's an important step. Okay, so when you put your dough in the bowl, it gets oil all over the bottom side of it, which is great, but we're gonna cover this with plastic wrap. So we wanna flip it so that the oil-coated bottom part becomes your top part, which creates kind of a non-stick surface if it comes in contact with the plastic wrap. So, to my plastic wrap, we need to put this somewhere fairly warm so it can rise until it's doubled in size. This is usually a half hour to 45 minutes. If it's cold, it's gonna be longer. If it's the middle of summer and you have a space that's, 95 degrees and reasonably humid, it's gonna be a half hour, maybe less. I think I last did loaf bread from here. All right. I think those are in to save them for later. Okay, so with mine, I'm gonna set my lower oven. I have a setting for bread proof, which puts it at 100 degrees. And that's a little bit warmer than what it is in the room where I'm cooking right now, so it will help it. It creates a stable environment, and also it gets it off the counter so I can go move on with my day. Now, next step, when that doubles in size, is gonna be either rolling or stretching your pizza crust, and then you're gonna be ready to bake pizza. All right, our pizza is ready. Well, it's not quite pizza yet. Our dough is ready. It's finished its first rise. It's doubled in size. Now, I'm gonna close that for just a second because we need to set up our oven that we're going to in fact be baking in. Because I'm doing 3 big rectangles and 2 circle pans, I'm gonna go ahead and set up 3 racks in my oven as evenly spaced as I can. You're gonna wanna do the same with yours. If you're only gonna use 2 racks, get them as evenly spaced around the middle of the oven as you can. I have a convection oven, so I'm gonna put it on 385 convect bake. If I'm using a conventional oven, it's 400. So while that's preheating, I am then going to pull out my dough, and I'm done with the lower oven. So goodbye, lower oven. All right, I have my pans. I already tore off my parchment paper. Parchment paper, you can make pizza without it. You certainly can, and I have in a pinch, but it will make your life so much easier. It's worth running out to the grocery store to get it. For real. It will make your life so much easier. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and start with the small circle pans. I'm gonna show you the rolling, well, no, I'll start with just stretch. You can either hand stretch it, which means you put a ball of dough in the middle and you stretch it out into the circular shape, or you can use a rolling pin to do the same thing. And I have done both. It just depends on what I have on hand. If it's just me prepping it, I will go ahead and use a rolling pin because I think it's a little bit faster. I'm gonna put just a little bit of flour on my pan. So this first one we're gonna stretch, and this is one of my circle ones. So essentially, this is gonna be half of a quarter of the dough. So take my dough, and it doesn't have, if you want it exact, you're gonna wanna use your scale and do it by weight. But I'm okay not being completely exact. So now I'm at 2/4, and then it doesn't look like much dough, does it? About even. But this is gonna be enough dough for this circle pan. So I'm gonna put this other one back in the bowl. See, I've kind of got them shaped. So this big lump is gonna be 2 rectangles. There's one rectangle and there's the other circle pan. So if you are finger stretching it and you're doing a circle pan, I start from the middle-ish. And I use 2 hands. Now, I'm working quickly because I've been doing this for a while. And yes, you could probably get fancy and spin it, and if you can, that's awesome. I'm not. This method will work too. I've seen my kids take it like Play-Doh and they tear it into little pieces and then stick them back together, and that's cool too. Because you know what you're gonna do with this? You're gonna put all kinds of yummy stuff on top of it and throw it in the oven, and you will never see it again because it's gonna go straight from there to someone's belly, and it's all good. So for all my perfectionist friends, it's okay if this is imperfect. Once the toppings are on, no one's gonna know. As long as you, now, the one thing you do wanna make sure and do, you can see I'm squeezing little holes back, like, here, I'll do, pull a hole. So as you stretch it, see, holes happen, it's all right. Especially this counter is cold because it's a stone counter. It chills the dough through the pan, and cold dough does not stretch as well as nice warm dough. Just something to be aware of. Now, these are fairly thin crusts. I guess if you want super thick crusts, you won't make as many pizzas with as much dough. But as yummy as this crust is, we like to keep a lot of the focus on the toppings. Now, the other trick that I have learned over the years of making pizza is that I always pre-bake these crusts. That's why we are preheating the oven right now. Mine's only at 174 degrees supposedly, so we have a few minutes. I should be able to probably get 2 more of these stretched by the time it is preheated. So they will preheat for about 6 minutes. I would start there, and if what you're looking for when you're pre-baking your crust is that it's no longer doughy in the middle. Like if you touch it in the middle very lightly because it's hot, and your finger doesn't dip in like dough, then you can go ahead and pull it out and add your toppings and then bake it for real. Now, how long does a pizza bake, you ask? Well, it depends on what you put on it. If it's a plain pizza with just, you know, like a little teeny sprinkle of cheese, it can be baked in as little as 15 minutes after you've pre-baked your crust and added your cheese. It could be 10 to 15 minutes to bake after that. Now, if you're adding lots of veggies and cheese and all that good stuff, it's gonna be longer, about 25 minutes. And you're gonna know that it's done because whatever you're using for cheese, whether it's dairy cheese or we're making I made cashew cheese for our pizza tonight because we're eating plant-based, it will brown on top because of the fat in it. Any fat that you cook with will brown when it's cooked under a high temperature, and that's what you're gonna look for, because that means the water products that are underneath it, a lot of that has cooked off, and your cheese is then hot enough to brown on the outside and get melty and good. Whether it's cashew cheese or a cheese, like there's veggie cheeses that are made with coconut oil and other products, they'll brown the same way, or dairy cheese will do that. Okay, so this is one where I stretched the crust, and you can see, I mean, it certainly works, but look, it's imperfect, and that's gonna be just fine because it's gonna be covered with yummy stuff, and it will taste yummy even without toppings. But this is a stretched crust one. Now I'll show you what it looks like when you use your rolling pin. Rolling pin, I am not gonna put it on the pan before rolling it out, because the pan gets in the way. And just like if you were rolling out cookie dough, you want to lightly coat it with flour. I don't know, a little bit more flour. Yeah. I prefer, this is considered a French style rolling pin. I prefer it, but you use whatever you have. If you have a dowel, you could try that, as long as it's thick enough. See how this is stretching out pretty quickly? And I'm getting close to my pizza pan size. But this one, you see how it's kind of bouncing back? That's what it's supposed to do. So what I try and do is slightly over roll it so that it has room to shrink a touch. And and as you can see, I do not leave an edge. That edge where it gets a little thicker, it will happen all by itself. I also take my pizza toppings all the way to the edge because I feel like it's wasted real estate if you don't. So check it out. So this is one that's done with a rolling pin. You can tell it's much more uniform thickness. I mean, it's a rolling pin instead of my fingers. But if you don't have a rolling pin, hand stretching it sure gets the job done. I have a few more minutes on the preheating. I'm gonna go ahead and roll out the rectangle. So, what do I put on my pizzas? Since we have taken the family plant-based, we put all kinds of different things on. I have a pesto that's over in the food processor. It's a pesto that's made with oregano, basil, olive oil, avocado, yellow squash, a little bit of pepper, rosemary. There is no garlic and no onions in there because Brianna and I aren't tolerating those very well. But in a traditional pesto, garlic would definitely be present. We have plant-based sausage here. That will go on the pizza. That's very popular. This is a little bit of pepperoncini. It's from the garden. It was just sliced. You can see it's just slightly browning from oxygenation. I've got yellow squash, just because I have it right now, and it's not a big flavor type of vegetable. So when you're adding vegetables to food, it's a great one to do. Some red and green peppers. This is a little bit of tomato that I had from the other day. This is a little bit unusual, but super tasty on pizza. It's spicy pickled beets. They're pickled in slices, so they go onto the pizza pretty easily. I made cashew cheese, and we will have some pretty, oh, and there's marinara here somewhere. Yeah, this is marinara, but it was made, you can see the color, it was made with yellow tomatoes. So when you make marinara with yellow tomatoes, it's not red. but it still makes good marinara. So, rectangle pizza, taking it long. I'm also, so it's a combination of hand stretching it and then rolling it to get it to a rectangular shape. Just using a rolling pin will default you to a rounder shape. See, and I'm still pinching if there's any little, holes that open up, pinching them together and moving right along. Doing multiple directions. And you'll notice it does like to stay a little bit thicker in the middle. You gotta push that back out. It's like you send it out and then it's like, oh no, I didn't really want to. So you send it out again. This is definitely more elastic than say if you're rolling out a pie crust or cookie dough. And that's because it's a yeasted bread. But it will roll and it will rise again slightly in the oven once it gets hot. It's pretty cool. Like you'll see on these, you might end up with a great big bubble after you do your first pre-bake on them, and that's okay. You can either just pop the bubble or it will actually deflate on its own as the air inside that bubble cools. So while you're putting the toppings on. All right. My oven is getting close. Let's see. This one might be pretty good. So yeah, to finish out the rectangular pizzas, I'll get them close where they're just on the paper and then make adjustments once I put it in the pan. And again, when you use the rolling pin, it's a really nice level surface. But I do find I get more of the giant, like one giant, almost like a pita pocket bubble when I use the rolling pin. But it makes no difference in the final pizza product. Whether you hand pull it, spin it, or use the rolling pin. Because again, once you add the toppings, it will be in good shape. I keep looking over to see where my oven is temperature-wise. I want to get these in. But, yeah, 359. The problem with, the reason why I'm not putting them in the oven before it is hot, it is because to preheat your oven, whether your coils are in the bottom, the top, or both, they are going to be a lot hotter than your end temperature. So right now I want my oven to get to 385. But the coils in there are probably well over 500 degrees because they're trying to warm the entire oven up to 385. So if I went ahead and put my one of these pizza crusts in now, it will burn on the top or on the bottom depending on where your coils are, because it's actually a lot hotter. They'd be exposed to a much higher temperature than the temperature you're aiming for. Once it achieves its temperature, and each oven is a little bit different in the way it works, but when it tells you, okay, I'm 385, it's saying that an even oven temperature has been achieved at 385 degrees, and then it usually will actually, for the most part, turn off the heating element until the temperature dips again and it has to bring it back up. But if you put your food in early, it will usually burn it, so you don't want to do that. I've done that. Done that and had disappointing dinners courtesy of that, because I really wanted to know why I had to wait, because I knew it was hot, and it was kind of close, and yes, it was kind of close, but when the heating element is still on, it will not cook your food evenly. All right, 374, I'm getting close. So, if anything, with this pizza crust, you're seeing that there's lots of ways, or there's at least more than one way to do it. If you don't have a rolling pin, stretch it with your hands. If you really like using a rolling pin, great, use it. It will not ruin your pizza. For a long time, I was afraid it would squish my pizza too much. It absolutely does not. The pizza does not stay this flat. And also, pizza crust, because it's a single rise bread, is not meant to be as fluffy as, say, breadsticks or something like that. That has a second rise involved. So, either way is completely acceptable in my book. It just depends on what you have on hand. The one thing that will make your life much easier, regardless of whether you have aluminum pans or pizza stones or whatever nifty gizmo you have, what will make your life way easier is parchment paper. It really does create a nice insulating surface that evens out the heat distribution regardless of your pan, and also it makes cleanup a snap. Absolutely a snap. So when I take these completed pizzas out of the oven, I actually just slide the whole thing out of the pan on the parchment paper onto a cutting board or a cutting mat like this blue one, but clean. And then we slice the pizza on top of the parchment paper on a cutting board, and it just makes everything much more seamless and, again, an easier cleanup. That was my chime! All right, let's put some of these in the oven. I'm gonna put my big one in the middle and the two smaller circles on the top and the bottom respectively. And set my timer for 6 minutes. 6 minutes, and we'll check back in 6 minutes so I can show you what that crust looks like when it's ready to top. All right, timer is about to go off, and we should have 3 crusts that are ready to top. So let's take a peek. Check this top one first. Perfect. All right, so I'm gonna get this one out. So these pans are hot. To protect your counter, I use a clean old towel. Again, it's clean, it's just, old. And it creates a nice insulating layer between the hot pan and the counter. See, there's a bubble. You see it? It'll go down. But see how it's not doughy at all in the middle. No brown spots yet, and it'll still be fine if there are some brown spots, like that, the baking brown spots. But this is right where I want it, as far as it's not doughy anymore, and it'll, they stay on the pan for right now, because getting a loaded pizza crust back in the pan is really difficult. You're gonna leave them in the pan until they've got the toppings on and they baked again with all your toppings. So, my rolled circle got the holes too, just like pita bread would. See the bubbles? And this one browned just a touch around the edge, but that's perfect. This is just gonna be great, because as soon as you put sauce on, which is the first thing you're gonna add, right? That adds moisture. So if you put your toppings on a raw pizza crust, it will eventually bake, but that's generally when you're gonna get the mushiest middle part, which is, I find it disappointing. I'm like, oh, my pizza's so good, but then it's squishy. I want squishy pizza. So these guys go in for their 6 minutes, and I'm gonna call the kids in to decorate pizza, and we're gonna have pizza tonight. Enjoy.